Duke Edward Halston had spent 28 years preparing for a marriage that would never be about love. From the moment he could understand the weight of his title, he had known that his bride would be chosen by duty, not desire, a strategic alliance between great houses that would strengthen bloodlines and consolidate power. He had resigned himself to a life of polite indifference with a woman whose name had been written beside his in family ledgers since childhood. What he had not prepared for was the moment Lady Victoria Langford would step into his London townhouse drawing room on a rain-soaked April morning in 1825, her emerald eyes sparkling with intelligence and mischief, her auburn hair catching the lamplight like burnished copper, and her smile transforming what should have been a tedious formality into the most important moment of his life. As she curtsied with perfect grace while somehow managing to look as though she were suppressing laughter at the absurdity of their arranged introduction, Edward felt his carefully ordered world shift on its axis. This wasn't the dutiful, unremarkable young woman he had expected to tolerate for the sake of family honor. This was a force of nature disguised as a proper lady, and in the space of a heartbeat, Edward realized that the marriage he had dreaded might just become the greatest adventure of his life, if he was brave enough to let it. The morning of April 15, 1825, found Duke Edward Halston standing before the tall windows of his London townhouse, watching the spring rain create rivulets down the glass while he contemplated the momentous day ahead. At 28, Edward cut an impressive figure, tall and lean with dark blonde hair that caught golden highlights in the lamplight, piercing blue eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of aristocratic bearing that had been bred into the Halston line for centuries. Today, he would finally meet Lady Victoria Langford, the woman who had been promised to him since they were both children, the woman who would become his Duchess within 2 months' time. The arrangement had been negotiated by their families when Edward was 15 and Victoria was 12, a strategic alliance between two of England's most powerful ducal houses that would unite vast estates and considerable political influence. "Your Grace," his secretary, Mr. Pemberton, appeared in the doorway of the study with his usual efficient bearing. "Lady Langford and her mother, the Duchess of Langford, will arrive within the hour. Shall I review the arrangements once more?" "That won't be necessary," Edward replied, though privately he wondered if any amount of preparation could ready him for this meeting. "Has the staff been briefed on the proper protocols?" "Of course, Your Grace." "Mrs. Hartwell has ensured that everything will proceed with perfect propriety." Edward nodded, though he felt anything but prepared. For 13 years he had known this day would come, had accepted it as an inevitable part of his duty as a duke. He had received reports about Lady Victoria's education, her accomplishments, her health, and her character, all delivered through intermediaries and family connections. By all accounts, she was a suitable bride, well-educated, properly bred, and possessed of the kind of quiet dignity that would serve her well as a duchess. What he didn't know was whether he would feel anything for her beyond polite respect. Edward had always assumed that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, that his marriage would be a partnership based on mutual duty rather than mutual affection. He had made his peace with that reality, or so he thought. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell, his housekeeper, appeared with the kind of maternal concern that had characterized her service to the Halston family for over 20 years. "Might I suggest you take some breakfast? You've been pacing since dawn, and you'll need your strength for the day ahead." "I'm not particularly hungry," Edward admitted, though he appreciated her concern. "Nerves are perfectly natural, Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell said gently. "Meeting one's intended bride is a momentous occasion, even when the match has been long arranged." "I'm not nervous," Edward protested, though even as he said it he realized it wasn't entirely true. He wasn't nervous about the meeting itself. He had been trained since childhood to handle any social situation with perfect composure. What unsettled him was the uncertainty of what he might feel, or fail to feel, when he finally met the woman who would share his life. "Of course not, Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell replied, with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she saw right through his denial. "Nevertheless, I've prepared a light breakfast in the morning room, should you change your mind." After she left, Edward returned to his contemplation of the rain-soaked street outside. Somewhere in London, Lady Victoria Langford was preparing for this same meeting, probably experiencing her own mixture of anticipation and resignation. Did she feel the weight of expectation as heavily as he did? Did she wonder, as he did, whether they would find any common ground beyond their shared duty? Edward had always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to approach even the most complex situations with logic and clear thinking. But as the minutes ticked by toward the appointed hour, he found his thoughts becoming increasingly scattered. What if Lady Victoria was nothing like the reports suggested? What if she was cold or shallow or completely incompatible with his temperament? What if they disliked each other on sight? Worse yet, what if she was everything the reports claimed, pleasant, dutiful, and perfectly suitable, but inspired no feeling in him whatsoever? The prospect of spending the rest of his life in a marriage devoid of genuine affection was somehow more daunting than the possibility of active dislike. "Your Grace," Pemberton reappeared, his expression carefully neutral. "The Duchess of Langford's carriage has been spotted turning onto the square. They should arrive momentarily." Edward felt his pulse quicken despite his efforts to remain calm. "Thank you, Pemberton. Please ensure that we're not disturbed once the introductions have been made. I'd like the opportunity to speak with Lady Victoria privately." "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I escort the ladies to the blue drawing room?" "Yes, that will be perfect." Edward made his way to the drawing room, checking his appearance one final time in the mirror above the fireplace. His morning coat was perfectly tailored, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, and his boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked every inch the Duke he was born to be, but he wondered if Lady Victoria would see anything beyond the title and the duty that bound them together. The sound of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones announced the arrival of his guests, and Edward positioned himself near the fireplace, adopting the kind of relaxed but dignified pose that had been drilled into him since childhood. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would shape the course of his entire life. "Your Grace," Pemberton announced from the doorway. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Langford, and Lady Victoria Langford." Edward turned toward the door, prepared to greet his intended bride with the kind of polite formality that the occasion demanded. What he was not prepared for was the vision that stepped into his drawing room and completely altered his understanding of what this marriage might become. Lady Victoria Langford was nothing like what he had expected. Where he had anticipated a quiet, unremarkable young woman who would blend seamlessly into the background of his life, he found himself face to face with someone who commanded attention simply by existing. She was tall for a woman, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with inner fire. Her eyes were the color of emeralds, bright with intelligence and what looked suspiciously like suppressed amusement. Her features were classical but animated, and when she smiled, a real smile, not the practiced expression he had expected, Edward felt something shift in his chest. She wore a morning dress of deep green wool that complemented her coloring perfectly, with a high neckline and long sleeves that spoke of proper breeding, while somehow managing to enhance rather than hide her natural grace. But it wasn't her beauty that struck him most forcefully. It was the sense of vitality that seemed to radiate from her, the impression that here was a woman who thought and felt and lived with an intensity that most people never achieved. "Your Grace," the Duchess of Langford said, offering a curtsy that was perfectly calculated to show respect without deference, "may I present my daughter, Lady Victoria?" Victoria stepped forward and sank into a curtsy that was technically flawless, while somehow managing to convey the impression that she found the entire formal ritual rather amusing. When she rose and met Edward's eyes directly, he saw intelligence, curiosity, and something that might have been mischief dancing in those remarkable green depths. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that made even the formal address sound warm and genuine. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. I confess I've been quite curious about the man I meant to marry." Edward felt his carefully prepared speech desert him entirely. He had planned to deliver a polite welcome, to express his pleasure at finally making her acquaintance, to set the tone for a proper and dignified courtship. Instead, he found himself staring at her like a man who had never seen a woman before. "Lady Victoria," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, "the pleasure is entirely mine. Please, won't you sit down?" As Victoria settled herself gracefully in one of the elegant chairs, Edward couldn't help but notice the way she moved, with a natural grace that spoke of excellent breeding, but also of genuine confidence in her own body. She wasn't the kind of woman who would fade into the background of any room, and Edward found himself wondering how he had ever imagined he could be content with a marriage based on mere duty. "I hope your journey from the country wasn't too arduous," Edward said, falling back on the kind of polite conversation that had been his refuge in countless social situations. "Not at all," Victoria replied, and Edward caught the hint of laughter in her voice. "Though I must admit I was rather nervous about this meeting. It's not every day one meets one's intended husband for the first time. Her honesty was refreshing and completely unexpected. Most young ladies of her station would have offered some bland pleasantry about the weather or the beauty of his home. Victoria's willingness to acknowledge the unusual nature of their situation suggested a directness that Edward found both surprising and appealing. "I confess to some nervousness myself," Edward admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. "It's a rather unique situation, isn't it? Being introduced to someone you're meant to marry." "Unique is certainly one word for it," Victoria said with a smile that made Edward's heart skip a beat. "Though I suppose our families would prefer the term traditional. They seem to believe that love is far too unreliable a foundation for marriage." The casual way she mentioned love made Edward's pulse quicken. Was she suggesting that she hoped for more than a marriage of convenience? Or was she simply acknowledging the romantic ideals that their practical arrangement would necessarily exclude? "And what do you believe?" Edward asked, genuinely curious about her answer. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and Edward saw something thoughtful and perhaps wistful cross her features. "I believe that love and duty need not be mutually exclusive," she said finally. "I believe that two people who respect each other and share common values might find that affection grows naturally from partnership. And I believe that a marriage based on genuine friendship and mutual regard might prove more satisfying than one based on either pure passion or pure convenience." Edward felt something warm unfurl in his chest at her words. Here was a woman who understood the realities of their situation, but refused to accept that those realities precluded the possibility of genuine happiness. Her philosophy suggested a maturity and wisdom that he hadn't expected, combined with an optimism that he found both attractive and inspiring. "That's a remarkably balanced perspective," Edward said, and he meant it. "I confess I had resigned myself to a marriage of pure duty. The possibility of finding something more hadn't occurred to me." "Perhaps," Victoria said with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room, "we might surprise ourselves." Before Edward could respond, the Duchess of Langford cleared her throat delicately, reminding them both that they were not alone. Edward had been so focused on Victoria that he had almost forgotten her mother's presence entirely, a lapse in social awareness that was completely unlike him. "Your Grace," the Duchess said to Edward, "I wonder if you might show Victoria the gardens. I understand they're particularly lovely this time of year, and it would give you both an opportunity to become better acquainted." "I would be delighted," Edward replied immediately, rising to offer Victoria his arm. "That is, if Lady Victoria would enjoy a walk despite the rain." "I love walking in the rain," Victoria said, accepting his arm with a smile that made Edward feel as though he had just won some sort of prize. There's something magical about gardens when they're fresh and green from spring showers. As they made their way through the house toward the garden doors, Edward was acutely aware of Victoria's presence beside him. She moved with a natural grace that made even the simple act of walking seem elegant, and he caught the subtle scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. When she commented on the paintings they passed or asked questions about the history of various pieces, her observations revealed both intelligence and genuine curiosity. "This portrait is remarkable," Victoria said, pausing before a painting of Edward's grandfather in full ducal regalia. "The artist captured something beyond mere physical likeness. There's a sense of the man's character in his expression." "That's exactly what my grandmother always said," Edward replied, pleased by her perceptiveness. "She claimed that portrait revealed more about my grandfather's personality than 20 years of marriage had." "And what did it reveal?" Victoria asked with genuine interest. "That he was a man who took his responsibilities seriously, but never forgot how to laugh," Edward said, studying the familiar painting with new eyes. "She said that combination of duty and joy was what made him such an effective duke and such a wonderful husband." "Duty and joy," Victoria repeated thoughtfully. "What a lovely legacy to leave behind." As they stepped out into the garden, Edward was struck by how perfectly Victoria seemed to fit into his world. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and clean, and the spring flowers were beginning to show their colors against the backdrop of ancient trees and carefully manicured lawns. Victoria moved through the garden as though she belonged there, commenting on the design and asking intelligent questions about the plantings. "You have a remarkable knowledge of horticulture," Edward observed, as Victoria correctly identified several unusual specimens. "I've always loved gardens," Victoria replied, bending to examine a particularly fine example of early roses. There's something deeply satisfying about watching things grow and flourish under careful tending. I suppose it appeals to my practical nature. You consider yourself practical? Edward asked, intrigued by this self-assessment. Extremely practical, Victoria confirmed with a laugh. I believe in making the best of whatever situation I find myself in, and I believe that happiness is usually a choice rather than an accident. That's probably why I'm not more distressed about our arranged marriage. I see it as an opportunity rather than a limitation. An opportunity for what? Edward asked, though he thought he was beginning to understand her perspective. An opportunity to build something meaningful with someone I might come to care about deeply, Victoria said simply. An opportunity to create a partnership that benefits not just our families, but ourselves as well. An opportunity to prove that arranged marriages can be just as fulfilling as romantic ones, if both parties are willing to invest in making them so. Edward felt his admiration for this remarkable woman growing with every word she spoke. Here was someone who faced their unusual situation with optimism and determination, who saw possibilities where he had seen only obligations. Her attitude was transforming his own perspective on their engagement, making him wonder if he had been too quick to assume that duty and happiness were incompatible. "Victoria," he said, using her given name for the first time and feeling a small thrill at the intimacy it implied. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you truly content with this arrangement? Or are you simply making the best of a situation you cannot change?" Victoria stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her green eyes serious but not unhappy. "Edward," she said, and the sound of his name on her lips sent warmth spreading through his chest. "I won't pretend that I never dreamed of a romantic courtship or a love match, but I've also never been one to waste time mourning what cannot be. This arrangement offers me the chance to marry a man who is intelligent, honorable and kind, qualities that seem far more important for long-term happiness than fleeting passion." "You think I'm kind?" Edward asked, surprised by how much her good opinion meant to him. "I think you're a man who takes his responsibilities seriously, but doesn't let them make him cold or cruel," Victoria replied. "I think you're someone who would treat his wife with respect and consideration, even if he didn't love her. And I think you're someone who might be capable of love, given the right circumstances." Edward felt something shift in his chest at her words. The idea that this remarkable woman saw potential in him, that she believed him capable of the kind of deep feeling he had always assumed was beyond his reach, was both humbling and exhilarating. "And what about you?" he asked quietly. "Do you think you might be capable of love given the right circumstances?" Victoria's smile was soft and full of promise. "I think, Edward, that I might already be discovering the answer to that question." As they stood facing each other in the spring garden, surrounded by the fresh green growth of new life, Edward felt his carefully ordered world reorganizing itself around this extraordinary woman. What had begun as a duty was already becoming something far more precious, the possibility of genuine partnership, deep affection, and perhaps even love. For the first time in his life, Edward found himself looking forward to his wedding day, not as an obligation to be endured, but as the beginning of an adventure he could hardly wait to begin. Discovering each other. Over the following weeks, Edward found himself counting the hours between his visits with Victoria. What had begun as formal courtship calls required by propriety had evolved into something he looked forward to with an anticipation that surprised him. Each conversation revealed new facets of her personality. Each shared laugh deepened his appreciation for her wit and intelligence. "You're distracted this morning?" his friend Lord Ashworth observed as they rode through Hyde Park on a crisp May morning. "I've been speaking for the past 5 minutes about the proposed reforms to the Corn Laws, and you haven't heard a word I've said." "I heard every word," Edward protested, though privately he had to admit that his thoughts had been entirely occupied with his plans to call on Victoria that afternoon. "Really? Then what was my opinion on the impact of tariff reductions on agricultural employment?" Edward felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized he had indeed been completely inattentive. "I apologize, James. My mind has been elsewhere lately." "Ah," Ashworth said with a knowing grin. "The mysterious Lady Victoria Langford, I presume. You've been positively transformed since your engagement was announced. I hardly recognize the serious, duty-bound Duke I've known for years." "Is it that obvious?" Edward asked, though he wasn't entirely displeased by his friend's observation. "To anyone who knows you well, yes," Ashworth replied. "You're practically glowing with happiness, Edward. It's quite remarkable to see, actually. I had begun to think you were incapable of such emotion." So had I, Edward admitted with a rueful smile. Victoria has a way of bringing out aspects of my personality that I didn't know existed. She must be quite extraordinary to have accomplished such a transformation in so short a time. She is, Edward said simply, and the warmth in his voice made Ashworth raise his eyebrows in surprise. Good God, Edward, you're in love with her. The words hit Edward like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they forced him to acknowledge what he had been trying not to examine too closely. Was he in love with Victoria? The intensity of his feelings, the way she occupied his thoughts, the anticipation he felt at the prospect of seeing her, all of it pointed to an emotion he had never expected to experience. I think I might be, Edward said quietly, the admission feeling both terrifying and wonderful. And how does she feel about you? Ashworth asked with genuine curiosity. I don't know, Edward replied honestly. She's warm and friendly, and I believe she enjoys my company, but whether her feelings extend beyond affection and respect, I can't be certain. Have you told her how you feel? Of course not, Edward said, horrified by the suggestion. We're to be married in 6 weeks. If she doesn't return my feelings, such a declaration would only make our situation uncomfortable. Or it might encourage her to examine her own feelings more closely, Ashworth suggested. Edward, you're about to marry this woman. Don't you think she deserves to know that you care for her as more than a convenient bride? Edward considered his friend's words as they completed their ride, but he couldn't bring himself to risk the comfortable relationship he and Victoria had built by introducing the complications that a declaration of love might bring. Better to let their feelings develop naturally, he told himself, than to force a crisis that might destroy the genuine affection that was growing between them. That afternoon, Edward called on Victoria at the Langford family's London residence, a magnificent townhouse in Mayfair that spoke of generations of wealth and influence. He was shown to the morning room, where he found Victoria arranging flowers with the kind of artistic skill that transformed a simple bouquet into something approaching sculpture. Edward, she said, looking up with a smile that never failed to make his heart skip a beat. You're early today. I hope that means you have more time to spend with me. As much time as propriety allows, Edward replied, settling into the chair across from her small table. Though I confess I find the restrictions of proper courtship rather frustrating. Frustrating how? Victoria asked, her hands never pausing in their work with the flowers. We're to be married in 6 weeks, yet we're never allowed to be truly alone together, Edward said. How are we supposed to get to know each other properly when there's always a chaperone hovering nearby? Victoria's laugh was like music. You sound like a man who has something particular he wants to discuss with me. Perhaps I do, Edward admitted, then found himself at a loss for how to proceed. What he wanted was to tell her about his growing feelings, to ask about her own emotions, to explore the possibility that their arranged marriage might become something deeper and more meaningful than either of them had dared hope. But the presence of her maid, sitting discreetly in the corner with her needlework, made such intimate conversation impossible. Then perhaps, Victoria said with a mischievous glint in her green eyes, we should arrange to accidentally encounter each other somewhere more private. Edward stared at her in surprise. Are you suggesting we meet in secret? I'm suggesting that two people who are engaged to be married might reasonably be expected to occasionally find themselves in the same location by coincidence, Victoria replied with mock innocence. For instance, I often take walks in the park early in the morning, when there are fewer people about, and I believe you mentioned that you enjoy riding at that same hour. Victoria, Edward said, lowering his voice, that would be highly improper. Would it? Victoria asked, her eyes sparkling with amusement. We are engaged, Edward. Surely that grants us some small latitude for private conversation. Edward found himself torn between his ingrained sense of propriety and his desperate desire to spend time alone with this remarkable woman. The idea of being able to speak freely with Victoria without the constraints of formal visiting protocols was incredibly appealing. Where in the park, he heard himself ask, and Victoria's delighted smile told him he had made the right choice. There's a small grove of trees near the Serpentine just past the bridge, Victoria said quietly. I often walk there around 7 in the morning. The light is particularly beautiful at that hour. I might find myself riding in that area tomorrow morning, Edward said, his heart racing at the prospect of their clandestine meeting. What a remarkable coincidence that would be, Victoria replied, with a smile that made Edward feel as though he were the cleverest man alive. The next morning found Edward waiting nervously in the grove Victoria had described, his horse tethered nearby while he paced among the trees. The early morning light filtered through the new leaves, creating patterns of gold and green that reminded him of Victoria's eyes. When she appeared on the path wearing a simple walking dress and a light shawl, Edward felt his breath catch at her beauty. "Good morning," Victoria said as she approached, her smile warm and slightly conspiratorial. "What a surprise to encounter you here." "Indeed," Edward replied, offering her his arm. "Shall we walk? I believe we have much to discuss." As they strolled through the quiet park, Edward marveled at how different Victoria seemed when freed from the constraints of formal visiting. She was more relaxed, more animated, more completely herself. Her observations about the people they passed were witty and perceptive. Her questions about his life and interests showed genuine curiosity, and her laughter came easily and often. "Tell me about your childhood," Victoria said, as they paused beside the Serpentine to watch the early morning light dance on the water. "What was it like growing up knowing you would be a duke?" "Lonely, mostly," Edward admitted, with an honesty that surprised him. "I was educated by tutors rather than attending school, and most of my time was spent learning about estate management, politics, and social obligations. I had few friends and little opportunity for the kind of carefree play that most children enjoy." "That sounds rather sad," Victoria said softly. "I thought it was normal," Edward replied. "It wasn't until I went to university that I realized how different my upbringing had been. Watching my classmates form friendships, pursue interests simply for pleasure, fall in love. It was like discovering a world I had never known existed." "And did you? Fall in love, I mean?" Victoria asked, and Edward thought he detected something more than casual curiosity in her voice. "No," Edward said simply. "I told myself it was because I knew I would have an arranged marriage, that there was no point in forming attachments that couldn't lead anywhere. But I think the truth is that I had never learned how to form deep emotional connections with anyone." "And now?" Victoria asked quietly. Edward stopped walking and turned to face her, struck by the vulnerability in her expression. "Now I find myself wondering if it's possible to learn such things as an adult. If someone who has spent his entire life focused on duty and obligation can discover what it means to truly care for another person." "I think," Victoria said, stepping closer to him, "that the capacity for love exists in everyone. It simply needs the right circumstances to flourish." "Victoria," Edward said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" she asked, her green eyes searching his face. "These past weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you. It's been the happiest period of my life," Edward said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. "I find myself thinking about you constantly, looking forward to our meetings with an anticipation that goes far beyond mere duty or even friendship." Victoria's breath caught, and Edward saw something kindle in her eyes that gave him the courage to continue. "I know our engagement was arranged for practical reasons, and I know you may not feel the same way, but I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with family expectations or social obligations. Victoria, I think I'm falling in love with you." For a moment, Victoria simply stared at him, and Edward felt his heart sink as he wondered if he had ruined everything with his premature declaration. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, not the polite social smile he was accustomed to, but something radiant and genuine that transformed her entire countenance. "Edward," she said softly, "do you really think you're the only one whose feelings have changed these past weeks?" "What do you mean?" Edward asked, hardly daring to hope. "I mean that I've been falling in love with you since the day we met," Victoria said, her voice warm with emotion. "I've been hoping and praying that you might come to feel something more than duty toward me, but I was afraid to hope too much." Edward felt as though the sun had suddenly emerged from behind clouds, illuminating his entire world with new possibility. "You love me?" he asked, needing to hear the words clearly. "I love you," Victoria confirmed, and the joy in her voice made Edward's heart soar. "I love your intelligence, your kindness, your sense of honor. I love the way you listen when I speak, the way you make me laugh, the way you see possibilities where others see only problems. I love you, Edward, completely and utterly." Without thinking, Edward reached for her hands, pulling her closer as he struggled to find words adequate to express the overwhelming happiness that filled him. "Victoria, I never imagined, I never dared hope." "Neither did I," Victoria said, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. "But here we are, two people who were promised to each other for practical reasons, discovering that we might have chosen each other anyway if we had been free to follow our hearts." "May I kiss you?" Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wondering when you would ask," Victoria replied with a smile that made Edward's heart race. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though they were both afraid of breaking the spell that had woven itself around them. But as Victoria responded, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of genuine passion and the promise of a lifetime of love to come. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Edward could see wonder and joy shining in Victoria's eyes. "I love you," he said again, marveling at how natural the words felt now that he had finally spoken them. "I love you too," Victoria replied, and Edward felt as though his heart might burst with happiness. As they walked back through the park, their hands linked and their faces glowing with joy, Edward marveled at how completely his life had changed. What had begun as a duty had become the greatest blessing he could have imagined. He was not just gaining a wife, he was gaining a partner, a companion, a love that would sustain him for the rest of his life. The arranged marriage he had dreaded had become the foundation for the kind of love story he had never believed possible. And as Victoria smiled up at him with eyes full of love and promise, Edward knew that their future together would be more wonderful than anything either of them had dared to dream. Preparing for forever. The weeks leading up to their wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparations, social obligations, and stolen moments together. Edward found himself transformed by love, approaching each day with an enthusiasm and joy that amazed everyone who knew him. The serious, duty-bound Duke had been replaced by a man who smiled frequently, laughed easily, and seemed to radiate happiness. "I hardly recognize you," his mother, the Dowager Duchess of Halston, observed one morning as they reviewed the final wedding arrangements in the family's London residence. "Marriage clearly agrees with you, even before the ceremony has taken place." "Victoria agrees with me," Edward corrected with a smile that made his mother's eyes soften with maternal pleasure. "I never understood before how much difference the right person could make." "She's a remarkable young woman," the Dowager Duchess agreed. "Intelligent, gracious, and clearly devoted to you. I confess I had worried about this arranged marriage, but seeing you together, it's obvious that you found something special." "More special than I ever imagined possible," Edward said, his voice warm with emotion. "Mother, I need to thank you for arranging this match. I know I wasn't enthusiastic about it initially, but you saw something I couldn't see." "I saw two young people who were well suited to each other," the Dowager Duchess replied. "But the love you found, that was your own doing, Edward. That was the result of both of you being open to possibilities beyond duty and obligation." That afternoon, Edward called on Victoria for what would be their last formal visit before the wedding. Tomorrow, she would become his Duchess, his wife, his partner in all things. The anticipation was almost overwhelming. He found her in the garden of her family's townhouse, wearing a dress of pale yellow silk that made her auburn hair glow like burnished copper in the afternoon sunlight. She was reading a book of poetry, but when she saw him approaching, she set it aside with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Edward," she said, rising to greet him with obvious pleasure, "I was just thinking about you." "Were you?" Edward asked, taking her hands in his and marveling, as he did every time he touched her, at the rightness of it. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about how much my life has changed since we met," Victoria replied, her green eyes serious but happy. 3 months ago, I was resigned to a marriage of convenience with a stranger. Now, I'm about to marry the man I love more than life itself. Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Edward asked, studying her face for any sign of anxiety or doubt. "Nervous about becoming your wife?" "Never," Victoria said firmly. "Nervous about the ceremony, about being the center of so much attention, about making sure everything goes perfectly." "Absolutely," Edward laughed, pulling her closer. "Victoria, you could trip walking down the aisle, forget your vows entirely, and spill wine on your dress, and it would still be the most perfect day of my life. All that matters is that at the end of it, you'll be my wife." "You say that now," Victoria teased, "but wait until you see me in my wedding gown. I might be so nervous I forget how to walk altogether. Then I'll carry you," Edward said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made Victoria's eyes fill with tears of happiness. "I love you," she whispered, and Edward felt the familiar surge of wonder that this remarkable woman had chosen to love him. "I love you too," he replied, leaning down to kiss her with all the tenderness and passion he felt. Tomorrow can't come soon enough. Their kiss was interrupted by the discreet clearing of a throat, and they broke apart to find Victoria's father, the Duke of Langford, approaching with an expression of fond amusement. "I hate to interrupt such a touching scene," he said with a smile. "But Victoria, your mother needs to speak with you about some last-minute details for tomorrow. And Edward, I was hoping we might have a word." "Of course, Your Grace," Edward replied, though he was reluctant to release Victoria's hands. "I'll see you tomorrow," Victoria said softly, squeezing his hands before stepping away. "Try not to worry about anything. It's going to be perfect." After Victoria disappeared into the house, the Duke of Langford gestured for Edward to join him on a bench beneath an ancient oak tree. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, both men contemplating the significance of the day ahead. "Edward," the Duke said finally, "I want you to know how pleased I am with this match. When we arranged this marriage years ago, I hoped for mutual respect and compatibility between you and Victoria. What you found together, it's more than any parent could hope for." "Victoria is extraordinary," Edward said simply. "I count myself the most fortunate man alive." "She feels the same way about you," the Duke replied with a smile. "But Edward, I want to speak to you not as the father of your bride, but as a man who has been married for 30 years to a woman he loves deeply." "I'm listening," Edward said, curious about what wisdom this experienced husband might share. "Marriage, even a marriage based on love, requires constant attention and effort," the Duke said seriously. "The feelings you have for each other now are wonderful, but they're just the beginning. Real love, the kind that lasts a lifetime, is built through shared experiences, mutual support during difficult times, and the daily choice to put your partner's happiness before your own." "I understand," Edward said, though he wondered if he truly comprehended the full implications of what the older man was saying. "I don't think you do. Not yet," the Duke said kindly. "How could you?" "But Edward, there will be times when marriage is difficult, when you and Victoria disagree about important matters, when external pressures threaten to drive you apart. In those moments, you must remember why you chose each other and fight for your love rather than taking it for granted." "What advice would you give me for being a good husband?" Edward asked, genuinely wanting to learn from someone who had clearly succeeded in marriage. "Listen to her," the Duke said immediately. "Really listen, not just to her words but to her feelings. Support her dreams and ambitions, even when they're different from what you might have planned. Be honest with her about your own struggles and fears. Don't try to be perfect, because perfection is lonely. And never, ever let pride prevent you from apologizing when you're wrong." "That sounds like the voice of experience," Edward observed. 30 years of experience," the Duke confirmed with a rueful smile. "I've made every mistake a husband can make, and a few that were uniquely my own. But I've also learned that a marriage between two people who truly love each other can survive almost anything, as long as both partners are committed to making it work." "Thank you," Edward said sincerely. "I'll remember your advice." "See that you do," the Duke replied, rising from the bench. "And Edward, welcome to the family. I couldn't have chosen a better husband for my daughter." That evening, Edward dined alone in his townhouse, too nervous and excited to have much appetite for the elaborate meal his cook had prepared. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, he would begin his life as a married man, with all the joys and responsibilities that entailed. "Your Grace," Pemberton appeared in the dining room doorway. "Lord Ashworth has called. Shall I show him in?" Please do," Edward replied, grateful for the distraction of his friend's company. Ashworth entered with his usual easy confidence, but Edward noticed that he carried a bottle of what appeared to be very fine champagne. "I thought you might need some company on your last night as a bachelor," Ashworth said, settling into the chair across from Edward. "And I brought something to toast your future happiness." "That's very thoughtful of you," Edward said, as Pemberton appeared with glasses and opened the champagne with practiced efficiency. "To love found in unexpected places," Ashworth said, raising his glass, "and to the wisdom to recognize it when it appears." "To Victoria," Edward replied simply, "and to the life we're going to build together." They drank, and Edward felt the bubbles tickle his throat as the excellent champagne went down. "Are you ready for this?" Ashworth asked, studying his friend's face with genuine curiosity. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Edward replied without hesitation. "James, I know this sounds absurd, but I feel as though my entire life has been leading up to tomorrow. Everything that came before was just preparation for becoming Victoria's husband." "That doesn't sound absurd at all," Ashworth said seriously. "It sounds like a man who has found his purpose. Edward, I've known you for 15 years, and I've never seen you as happy as you've been these past months. Victoria has transformed you." "We've transformed each other," Edward corrected. "That's what love does, isn't it? It brings out the best in both people, makes them more than they could be alone. Spoken like a man who's about to be married, Ashworth said with a grin. But seriously, Edward, I'm happy for you. You deserve this kind of love, this kind of happiness. They spent the evening talking about everything and nothing, with Ashworth regaling Edward with amusing stories from their university days, and Edward sharing his hopes and dreams for his married life. By the time his friend departed, Edward felt calmer and more centered, ready to face the momentous day ahead. As he prepared for bed, Edward found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he had been a man resigned to a life of duty without passion, obligation without joy. The arranged marriage had seemed like just another responsibility to be shouldered with dignity, but without enthusiasm. Now, as he stood at the threshold of that same marriage, Edward felt nothing but gratitude for the circumstances that had brought Victoria into his life. Their love might have begun with family arrangements and practical considerations, but it had grown into something pure and true and lasting. Tomorrow he would stand before God and society and promise to love, honor, and cherish Victoria for the rest of his life. It would be the easiest promise he had ever made, because he couldn't imagine a future that didn't include her by his side. As sleep finally claimed him, Edward's last conscious thought was of Victoria's smile, and the knowledge that when he woke, it would be his wedding day, the beginning of the greatest adventure of his life. The morning of June 20th, 1825, dawned clear and bright, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of Edward's townhouse as he prepared for the most important day of his life. His valet Thompson moved about the room with quiet efficiency, laying out the formal wedding attire that had been specially tailored for the occasion. "Nervous, Your Grace?" Thompson asked, as he helped Edward into his pristine white shirt and perfectly starched collar. "Excited," Edward corrected, though he had to admit his hands were slightly unsteady as he attempted to tie his cravat. "I don't think I've ever been more excited about anything in my life." "If I may say so, Your Grace, you're a very fortunate man," Thompson said, as he took over the cravat tying with the expertise of long practice. "Lady Victoria is a remarkable young woman." "That she is," Edward agreed, his voice warm with love and anticipation. The wedding was to take place at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, one of London's most fashionable venues for society marriages. As Edward's carriage rolled through the streets toward the church, he was struck by how different this day felt from what he had imagined. Instead of approaching his wedding with resignation or dutiful acceptance, he felt as though he were rushing toward the greatest joy of his life. The church was magnificent, decorated with white roses and trailing ivy that created an atmosphere of elegant beauty. As Edward took his place at the altar, he was dimly aware of the distinguished guests filling the pews, peers of the realm, family, friends, and members of both families who had come to witness the union of two great houses. But his attention was focused entirely on the church doors, waiting for the moment when Victoria would appear and their new life together would begin. The organ music swelled, and Edward's heart began to race as the processional began. First came the bridesmaids, Victoria's younger cousins dressed in pale pink silk, then her matron of honor, her married sister Catherine, resplendent in deep rose. And then finally, Victoria herself appeared in the doorway, and Edward felt his breath catch in his throat. She was absolutely radiant, wearing a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace that seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through the church windows. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style beneath a delicate veil, and she carried a bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms. But it was her face that captured Edward's complete attention. She was smiling, her green eyes bright with joy and love as they met his across the length of the church. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Edward felt as though time had slowed to allow him to savor every moment of this perfect day. When she reached the altar and her father placed her hand in his, Edward felt a sense of completion that he had never experienced before. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the church, "we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony passed in a blur of sacred words and solemn vows, but Edward was acutely aware of every moment. When it came time to speak his vows, his voice was strong and clear, filled with all the love and commitment he felt. "I, Edward, take thee, Victoria, to my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance. And thereto I plight thee my troth." Victoria's vows were equally heartfelt, her voice steady despite the tears of joy that sparkled in her eyes. "I, Victoria, take thee, Edward, to my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and to obey, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance. And thereto I give thee my troth." When Edward slipped the wedding ring onto Victoria's finger, he felt as though he were completing a circle that had been broken his entire life. This was what he had been missing, what he had been searching for without even knowing it, this sense of belonging, of being exactly where he was meant to be. "Those whom God hath joined together let no man put asunder," the Archbishop pronounced, and Edward felt a surge of joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. "You may kiss your bride," the Archbishop said with a smile, and Edward needed no further encouragement. The kiss was tender but passionate, a promise of all the love they would share in the years to come. When they broke apart, both were glowing with happiness, and the church erupted in applause and cheers from their guests. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Edward felt as though he were floating. The woman beside him was no longer his intended bride, but his duchess, his wife, his partner for life. The arranged marriage that had once seemed like a burden had become the foundation for the greatest love story he could have imagined. The wedding breakfast was held at the Duke of Langford's mansion, where the ballroom had been transformed into a garden paradise with flowers, greenery, and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow light throughout the room. Edward and Victoria moved through the celebration as though in a dream, accepting congratulations and good wishes from guests who seemed genuinely happy for the obviously devoted couple. "You look like a man who has everything he ever wanted," Lord Ashworth observed as he approached Edward during a lull in the festivities. "I feel like a man who has more than he ever dared to want," Edward replied, his eyes finding Victoria across the room where she was speaking with her grandmother. "James, I never imagined I could be this happy." "And Victoria?" Ashworth asked, following Edward's gaze. "She's radiant," Edward said softly. "She told me this morning that she feels like the luckiest woman alive. Can you believe that? She thinks she's the lucky one." "You're both lucky," Ashworth said seriously. "You've found something that most people search for their entire lives without ever discovering. Don't ever take it for granted." "Never," Edward said firmly. "I know exactly how precious this is." As the afternoon wore on, Edward found himself stealing moments alone with Victoria whenever possible, each touch of her hand, each shared smile, each whispered word of love adding to his overwhelming sense of joy and completion. "Are you ready to begin our honeymoon?" Victoria asked as they finally prepared to depart for Edward's country estate, where they would spend the first weeks of their married life. "I'm ready to begin our life together," Edward replied, helping her into their carriage as rose petals rained down from the well-wishers gathered to see them off. Our honeymoon, our marriage, our future, all of it. As their carriage rolled through the London streets toward the countryside, Edward marveled at how natural it felt to have Victoria beside him as his wife. She had changed from her elaborate wedding gown into a traveling dress of deep blue silk, but she was no less beautiful for the simpler attire. If anything, the more intimate setting of the carriage made her seem even more precious to him. "What are you thinking about?" Victoria asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how completely my life has changed," Edward replied, taking her hand in his. "This morning I was a bachelor who had never truly been in love. Tonight, I'm a married man who can't imagine existing without you. The transformation has been rather remarkable," Victoria agreed with a smile. "Do you remember what you said to me the first day we met? About resigned yourself to a marriage of pure duty? I remember thinking I was the most foolish man alive for ever believing such nonsense," Edward said, lifting her hand to his lips. "Victoria, you've shown me what it means to truly live, not just exist. We've shown each other," Victoria corrected gently. "Edward, I want you to know that even if our families had never arranged this marriage, even if we had met by pure chance at some social gathering, I would have fallen in love with you anyway. What we have isn't the result of convenience or obligation. It's real, and it's ours." Edward felt his heart swell with emotion at her words. "Do you really believe that?" "I know it," Victoria said firmly. "Some people are simply meant to find each other, Edward. The circumstances that bring them together are less important than what they choose to build once they meet. The The journey to Halston Park, Edward's ancestral estate in the Cotswolds, took several hours, but the time passed quickly as they talked about their hopes for the future, their plans for the estate, and their dreams of the family they hoped to build together. By the time they arrived at the grand manor house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless their arrival. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the estate's housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, greeted Victoria with obvious pleasure as they entered the magnificent entrance hall. "We're all so delighted to finally meet the new Duchess." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," Victoria replied warmly. "I'm looking forward to getting to know everyone and learning about my new home." Edward watched with pride as Victoria charmed the assembled staff with her genuine warmth and interest in their lives and work. She had a natural grace that made everyone feel valued and appreciated, and he could see that she would be a beloved mistress of the estate. "Shall I show you to your rooms, Your Grace?" Mrs. Whitmore asked after the introductions were complete. "That would be lovely," Victoria replied, though Edward noticed a slight flush in her cheeks that suggested she was as aware as he was of what the evening would bring. The Duchess's suite was magnificent, decorated in shades of cream and gold that complemented Victoria's colouring perfectly. French doors opened onto a balcony that overlooked the estate's famous rose gardens, and the sitting room was furnished with elegant pieces that spoke of generations of refined taste. "It's beautiful," Victoria said softly as she took in her new surroundings. "Edward, I can hardly believe this is all real." "Believe it," Edward said, moving to stand behind her as she looked out at the gardens. "You're the Duchess of Halston now, mistress of all you survey. This is your home, Victoria, for the rest of our lives." "Our home," Victoria corrected, leaning back against him. "I don't want to be just the mistress of your estate, Edward. I want to be your true partner in everything." "You already are," Edward said, wrapping his arms around her. "Victoria, I meant what I said in my vows. You're my equal, my companion, my other half. We'll face everything together, the joys and the challenges, the triumphs and the difficulties." They dined privately in Victoria's sitting room, served by discreet servants who seemed to understand that the newlyweds wanted time alone together. The meal was delicious, but Edward found himself far more interested in watching Victoria's animated conversation than in the elaborate dishes that appeared and disappeared. "You're not eating," Victoria observed with amusement. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling perfect," Edward replied. "I'm just distracted by how beautiful you are. How lucky I am to be sitting here with you as your husband." "Edward," Victoria said softly, "are you nervous about tonight?" The direct question surprised him, but he appreciated her honesty. "A little," he admitted. "Not because I don't want to be with you. I've never wanted anything more. But because I want everything to be perfect for you, and I'm not entirely certain I know how to make that happen." Victoria's smile was tender and understanding. "Edward, we're both new to this. We'll learn together, just as we've learned to love each other. All I need is your patience and your love." "You have both," Edward said immediately. "You have everything I am, Victoria, forever." After dinner they walked together in the moonlit gardens, talking quietly about everything and nothing, while the night air carried the scent of roses and jasmine around them. When they finally returned to the house, Edward escorted Victoria to her door with the kind of formal courtesy that seemed absurd, given that they were now married. "I'll give you time to prepare," Edward said awkwardly, suddenly feeling like the inexperienced young man he was despite his 28 years. "Edward," Victoria said, reaching up to touch his face gently, "I love you. Whatever happens tonight, remember that. I love you completely, and I trust you completely." "I love you too," Edward replied, leaning into her touch, "more than I ever thought possible." When Edward returned to Victoria's room an hour later, he found her waiting for him in a silk nightgown that was modest but beautiful, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, and her green eyes bright with love and anticipation. "Hello, husband," she said softly, and the words sent warmth spreading through Edward's entire being. "Hello, wife," Edward replied, marveling at how right it felt to use that word. "You're so beautiful, Victoria. I can hardly believe you're mine." "I'm yours," Victoria confirmed, stepping into his arms, "just as you're mine. We belong to each other now, Edward, in every way that matters." Their wedding night was everything Edward had hoped it would be, tender, passionate, and full of the kind of love that transformed physical intimacy into something sacred and profound. As they lay together afterward, Victoria's head on his chest and her hair spilling across his shoulder like silk, Edward felt a sense of completion that he had never experienced before. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Blissfully happy, Victoria replied, her voice warm with contentment. Edward, I never imagined marriage could be like this. I never imagined I could feel so complete. Neither did I, Edward admitted. Victoria, I want you to know that what we've found together, it's changed everything for me. You've changed everything. We've changed everything for each other, Victoria said, lifting her head to look at him with eyes full of love. And this is just the beginning, isn't it? We have our whole lives ahead of us to love each other, to build something beautiful together. Our whole lives, Edward agreed, pulling her closer. And I intend to spend every day of that life making sure you know how much I love you. Love's perfect design. 5 years later, Edward stood in the nursery of Holston Park, watching Victoria rock their newborn daughter, while their 3-year-old son, James, played quietly with his wooden soldiers on the carpet nearby. The scene was one of perfect domestic contentment, and Edward felt the same surge of overwhelming gratitude that had become his constant companion since the day he married Victoria. She's beautiful, Edward said softly, approaching the rocking chair where Victoria sat with baby Elizabeth. She has your eyes. And your stubborn chin, Victoria replied with a laugh, looking up at her husband with eyes that still sparkled with the same love and mischief that had captivated him from their first meeting. I think she's going to be quite the handful. Like her mother, Edward said fondly, leaning down to kiss Victoria's forehead. I wouldn't have it any other way. Papa, James called from his position on the floor. Come see my battle. The Red Soldiers are winning. Edward settled on the carpet beside his son, marveling at how naturally fatherhood had come to him. He had worried that his own lonely childhood would leave him ill-equipped to be a good father, but Victoria had helped him discover reserves of patience and playfulness he hadn't known he possessed. That's a very impressive battle formation, Edward said seriously, examining James's arrangement of toy soldiers. But what about the blue soldiers? Don't they deserve a chance to win? They can win tomorrow, James declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. Today is the Red Soldiers' Day. Fair enough, Edward agreed, ruffling his son's dark blonde hair. Everyone deserves their day to win. As the afternoon wore on, Edward found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. The arranged marriage that had once seemed like a burden had become the foundation for a love story more beautiful than anything he could have imagined. Victoria had not only become his wife and the mother of his children, but his truest friend, his most trusted advisor, and his constant source of joy and inspiration. What are you thinking about? Victoria asked, as she joined him on the sofa after putting the children down for their naps. I'm thinking about destiny, Edward replied, pulling her close against his side. About how sometimes what seems like obligation turns out to be the greatest gift we could receive. Do you really think it was destiny? Victoria asked, settling comfortably in his arms. Or do you think we simply had the wisdom to recognize a good thing when we found it? Both, Edward said after considering the question. I think we were meant to find each other, but I also think we chose to build something beautiful together. Destiny brought us to that first meeting, but love is what created everything that followed. I like that explanation, Victoria said with a smile. It gives credit to both fate and free will. Victoria, Edward said seriously, I want you to know that if I could go back and change anything about how we met, I wouldn't. Not the arranged marriage, not the family pressure, not even my initial reluctance. All of it led us to each other, and that makes every moment of uncertainty worthwhile. Even if you could have met me at a ball and courted me properly, Victoria teased, with flowers and poetry and romantic declarations. Even then, Edward said firmly, because this way, we knew from the beginning that we were choosing each other for who we really are, not for some romantic fantasy. We built our love on a foundation of honesty and genuine compatibility, and that's made it stronger than any passion-based attachment could be. You're very wise for a man who once thought love was a luxury he couldn't afford, Victoria observed with fond amusement. I had an excellent teacher, Edward replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. You taught me that love isn't a luxury. It's the most essential thing in life. Everything else is just details. As the sun set over the gardens of Holston Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Edward and Victoria sat together in perfect contentment. Their love story had begun with duty and obligation, but it had blossomed into something that transcended anything either of them had dared to dream. Edward, Victoria said softly, do you think James and Elizabeth will understand someday? About how we met? About the arranged marriage? I think they'll understand that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the most unexpected ways, Edward replied. And I think they'll be proud to know that their parents chose to see possibility where others might have seen only obligation. I hope they find love like ours, Victoria said wistfully. Whether it comes through arrangement or accident, I hope they find someone who sees them completely and loves them anyway. They will, Edward said with quiet confidence. Love like ours, it creates more love. Our children will grow up knowing what it looks like when two people truly cherish each other, and that knowledge will guide them to their own happiness. As they prepared for bed that night, Edward reflected on the miraculous transformation his life had undergone. The man who had once resigned himself to a loveless marriage of convenience had become a husband who woke each morning grateful for the woman beside him, a father who delighted in his children's laughter, and a duke who ruled his estates with the kind of joy and purpose that only love could provide. "I love you," Victoria said as they settled into their bed, the words as natural and necessary as breathing after 5 years of marriage. "I love you too," Edward replied, pulling her close. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows we'll share." As sleep claimed them, Edward's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude. He had been promised to another in an arrangement he had never wanted. But in meeting his intended bride, he had found the love of his life. Sometimes, he reflected drowsily, the best gifts came disguised as obligations, and the greatest adventures began with the smallest acts of faith. Their love story would be told for generations, not as a tale of duty overcome by passion, but as proof that true love could bloom anywhere, even in the most carefully arranged circumstances, when two hearts were brave enough to remain open to possibility. The Duke, who had been promised to another, had indeed found the love of his life, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes the most perfect love stories were the ones that began with the most imperfect circumstances. Edward and Victoria's story reminds us that love often arrives wearing the disguise of duty, obligation, or circumstance. Their journey teaches us that the most meaningful relationships aren't always born from passion at first sight, but can grow from mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to remain open to unexpected possibilities. Their transformation from reluctant participants in an arranged marriage to devoted partners proves that love is not just an emotion we feel, but a choice we make every day. They chose to see potential rather than limitation, opportunity rather than obligation, and partnership rather than mere convenience. May their love story inspire you to look beyond first impressions and initial circumstances, to believe that the most beautiful relationships often grow slowly and steadily, and to remember that sometimes what seems like fate's cruel joke turns out to be life's greatest gift. Subscribe for more enchanting historical romances where arranged marriages become love stories and duty transforms into devotion. Discover tales that prove the heart knows no boundaries when it comes to finding its perfect match. Comment. What moment in Edward and Victoria's journey touched your heart the most? Your next captivating romance adventure awaits.